As of Scarlet and Violet's release, the Pokemon games now have 5 main series entries on the Nintendo Switch. Yet despite the decent amount of entries, not every individual Pokemon has made an appearance in a Switch game yet. This is due to the removal of the National Dex. In previous generations, every single then existing Pokemon was programmed into each game. Even if a Pokemon couldn't be caught in a set of games, it could at least be transferred into them from a previous generation. For instance, while Go-Goat could not be caught in Sun and Moon, it could be caught in X and Y, and then transferred to Sun and Moon via Pokemon Bank. But starting with the Switch era of Pokemon, now the only Pokemon programmed into a game tend to just be the ones that were already catchable in the set of games anyway. Most Pokemon that aren't already catchable in a game can't be transferred into them, with only a small handful of exceptions. Ever since this change, there's been a fear that we might go an entire console generation without seeing a specific Pokemon. So today I thought I'd go through every Pokemon that hasn't appeared in a Switch game yet, and see how neglected these mons truly are. But before we start off on our journey, we should really check in at home first. Pokemon Home is a storage app for Switch and mobile that can store basically every Pokemon in existence, for transfer and trading purposes. So that's it, right? Every Pokemon is available on Switch. End of video? Well, sure. If all you want to do is stare at PNGs of your Pokemon, then yes, every Pokemon is available on Switch. But I wouldn't exactly consider the Home app to be a game, any more than I would consider the YouTube Switch app to be a game. Technically every Pokemon is available there too. For this exercise, I'm mainly just going to be looking at which Pokemon aren't in the mainline Switch games yet. Those being Let's Go, Sword and Shield and its DLC, BDSP, PLA, and Scarlet and Violet. But after I've gone through which Pokemon aren't in any of those games, I'll also go over the spin-off games too, just to see if any of the missing mons at least got a shout out there. There are currently 1008 Pokemon in existence. Wow, that's higher than the number of views this video is going to get. Before we get down to which ones aren't in the Switch game yet, I thought it'd be fun to go through and cross off all the ones that are. Don't worry, I'm not going to be painstakingly crossing them off one by one. I'll be doing it in pretty large groups. One group of Pokemon I want to set aside for now are the 22 Mythicals. Mythical Pokemon are ones that are normally only distributed through special events, rather than catching them in the game itself. And while most, if not all, of the mythical Pokemon are technically programmed into at least one Switch game, whether or not you can currently get it is a different story. Because their availability is a little more complicated, I want to wait until the end to discuss how obtainable each of them currently are. So excluding the Mythicals for now, that leaves us with 986 Pokemon to find in a Switch game. Theoretically speaking, I'm not actually going to be catching all of these like a madman. And the first batch of Pokemon we can easily cross off is, of course, every Pokemon introduced in Generation 8 and 9. This is because these generations are themselves Switch games, so obviously every Pokemon that debuted in them is going to be available on Switch. It would be kind of ridiculous if they weren't. Generation 8 introduced 95 new Pokemon, while Generation 9 has introduced 103 so far. Wow, Gen 9 has already overtaken Gen 8, and that's before it even got any DLC or anything. Those two gens together make for 198 Pokemon, so we can take that away from our current total of 986, leaving us with 788. Now that we've gotten rid of the newbies, what's the next batch of Pokemon we can most easily tick off? Well, to answer this, we should look to the Switch game that contains the largest number of Pokemon we haven't crossed off yet, which is, of course, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Being faithful remakes of the original Gen 4 games, it contains every Pokemon from those first 4 generations. So now we can confidently cross off those 484 Pokemon. Rest assured that they have at least one Switch game to their name. In fact, thanks to every Gen 1 Pokemon appearing in Let's Go, and every Gen 4 Pokemon appearing in PLA, all of the Pokemon from those 2 generations have at least 2 Switch games to their name. And between Sword and Shield, PLA, and Scarlet and Violet, a lot of the Gen 2 and 3 Pokemon have appeared in at least 2 Switch games as well. But there are still a few whose only appearances in BDSP, which some may consider a fate worse than death. So we can use BDSP to account for the first 4 generations of Pokemon, but what about the alternate regional forms? None of them are in BDSP. Well, every Alolan form is available in Let's Go, and every other alternate form was introduced in a Switch game, so we can cross all of them off as well. However, when it comes to available Pokemon in BDSP, there is one caveat we have to address: Spinda. For those who don't know, Spinda is a Pokemon with a rather unique gimmick. It has 4 spots on its face, but the exact placement of these spots is different for every Spinda. The spot placements are determined by Spinda's personality value, or encryption constant in later games, or whatever the hell that means. I'm just reading this off Bulbapedia. Basically, there are over 4 billion possible personality values, so the likelihood that you'll find 2 Spinda with the exact same spot patterns is pretty small. However, when it came to implementing Spinda in BDSP, there was a technical issue. Now, as you may have gathered by my I'm just reading this off Bulbapedia bit, I don't fully understand how these spot placements are determined, but I'm going to try and explain this as best I can. Basically, an 8-figure code is used to determine where the spots are placed, so the code 12, 34, 56, 78 would generate this Spinda pattern. But in BDSP only, this code is read in the reverse, so that same code would now be read as 78, 56, 34, 12 instead, which would inverse the placement of Spinda's spots. This means if you were to transfer a Spinda from the older generations to BDSP, its spots would come out in the wrong locations. So the Pokemon Company's solution to this problem was just to not let any of the past Spindas be transferred from home into BDSP, and to also not let any of the Spindas originating from BDSP into home. It's like quarantine but for V-Pets. I have no idea what they're going to do if Spinda appears in a future game. Are they going to go by the original rules or the BDSP rules? Either way, you're locking out a group of Spinda from future games forever, unless there's some way the two kinds can coexist. Or maybe they'll just cut their losses and never include Spinda in a game again. But just think, there's probably some poor guy out there who collected every Spinda pattern in existence, then excitedly put them into home, hoping he could see them in HD for the first time, and is now thinking, what the hell do I do with these now? Anyway, the reason I went on this whole Spinda tangent was just to point out that while it is technically available in a Switch game, any past Spinda you've transferred from the 3DS still doesn't have a Switch game it's allowed into. Now that I am done with Spinda, we can finally get on to the remaining 304 Pokemon, all of which are from generations 5 to 7. These generations are the awkward middle children of the franchise, where they aren't young enough to get all the attention of their parents, but also aren't old enough to get the same respect as their older siblings. But they haven't been completely neglected by Game Freak either. Between Sword and Shield, its DLC, and Scarlet and Violet, quite a large chunk of these generations Pokemon have made it into a Switch game already. Crossing these off is going to be a bit more complicated though, as I can't just cross off an entire generation at once, like I could do with the other gens. However, there is one group from these generations we can instantly account for, and that is all of the remaining legendary Pokemon, as all of them were made available in Sword and Shield's Crown Tundra DLC. That accounts for 23 of the remaining Pokemon, and we may as well throw in those 11 Freak Show Ultra Beasts now, so I don't have to think about them anymore. That just leaves us with 270 regular Pokemon left to go through. For this final set of Pokemon, I'm going to separate them out into 3 generations and go through them in chronological order. This means we'll start with Generation 5, which has the largest amount of remaining Pokemon with 143. That's a bit of an intimidating number. But luckily we can strike off 85 straight away, as that's how many Gen 5 Pokemon were in Sword and Shield's base game. Considering there are only 400 Pokemon in the Gala Dex, Gen 5 getting 85 of those slots is kind of impressive. That is over 20% of the whole Dex. Getting rid of those 85 leaves us with 58 Gen 5ers. But before we can move on from Sword and Shield, we still have to go over the DLC. The Isle of Armor brought 22 more Gen 5 Pokemon to the game, and the Crown Tundra brought a further 6. So we leave Sword and Shield with an even 30 Pokemon. The next Switch game we need to visit is Legends Arceus. There isn't as much to account for here, as only 13 Gen 5 Pokemon were present in the game, and only 3 of them were Pokemon that didn't appear in Sword and Shield already, this of course being the Oshawott line. However, we've actually got another weird case here when it comes to Samurott, as whilst Samurott's Hisuian form is present in the game, the original form isn't. In other games with regional forms, the original form of the Pokemon could still be transferred in, but PLA is actually the first game with regional forms where the original form can't be transferred into it. I think it's because the whole point of PLA is completing the Dex, and it would be unintuitive to add Dex entries for forms that weren't even catchable in the game. Yeah, I know it's weird that the alternate forms of Sneasel and Vulpix are here when none of the others are. Anyway, this puts the OG Samurott in kind of a weird position, where its pre-evolutions have a Switch game they can be transferred into, but it doesn't. However, we won't have to wait too much longer, as it has been confirmed that both forms of Samurott can be transferred into Scarlet and Violet. So when the Pokemon Home compatibility is added, we'll finally have a game where we can play with both of them. Because of this, I'll tick off the whole evolution line for now, which leaves us with 27 Gen 5 Pokemon. Speaking of Scarlet and Violet, let's move on to those games now. Excluding all of the ones that are in Sword and Shield already, Scarlet and Violet brought 6 more Gen 5 Pokemon to the Switch. Those being the gravity-defying Electros line, everyone's favourite not Love-Disc evolution, Alomalola? What the? I've never tried to say that out loud before. And all 4 of Deerling and Swordsbuck seasonal forms. Wow. Okay, can we take a minute to talk about Deerling? So the Gen 5 games had this cool mechanic where it would change season depending on what month you played the game. Finally, I can have winter in August like a true Australian. And the Pokemon Deerling and Swordsbuck would change form depending on what season it was. But like a lot of the cool mechanics Pokemon introduces, seasons were only around for a single generation before they got abandoned. Because of this, Deerling and Swordsbuck got sidelined pretty hard throughout Gen 6 and 7. They were only obtainable through post-game locations in Gen 6, and the only forms you could catch were the spring forms. They weren't catchable in Gen 7 at all, and in Gen 8, well I think you know why they weren't in Gen 8. It's almost like Deerling and Swordsbuck were deliberately hard to get, in the hopes that people would just forget about them, and the abandoned season mechanic they were associated with. Scarlet and Violet have finally rectified this by having them be catchable again, with forms simply being determined by location instead, which is probably what they should have been doing since Gen 6. Although, I wonder if Deerling's long absence has set a precedent that gimmicky form changes makes the Pokemon less likely to appear in future generations. Anyway, now that we've gone over Scarlet and Violet, we are left with 21 Gen 5 Pokemon, and these Pokemon are still completely unaccounted for in any mainline Switch game, these 21 being Snivy, Servine, Superior, Tepig, Pignite, Emboar, Padarat, Watchog, Pansage, Simisage, Pansear, Simisear, Panpour, Simipour, Blitzel, Substriker, Suaddle, Swadloon, Levani, Ducklet, and Swanna. Now, me going over how neglected Deerling was might have seemed like a tangent before, but it was more of a prelude to this section, because boy, these remaining 21 Pokemon have had it rough over the years. Obviously being absent from the Switch games for this long is bad, but they weren't even treated well in the 3DS era. Some of them have had it better than others, like Ducklet and the fan favourite Elemental Monkeys were at least catchable early on in X and Y. These games are almost 10 years old, but at least they were a part of the previous console generation. And Watchog was there too, but to be honest I'm completely fine if we never see Watchog again. The Blitzel and Suaddle lines, however, you had to jump through a lot of hoops to get them during the 3DS era, only being available through special post-game requirements. Out of all the absent Switch Pokemon, these guys are by far the ones the most in need of a comeback. Also notably amongst this group of absentees are the 2 remaining starter lines, Snivy and Tepig. In Generations 6 and 7, the Snivy and Tepig lines were also only available through post-game events, or the Island Scan. Although I think them being harder to obtain is understandable, as that's the case for a lot of starters outside of their generation. It is kind of weird to leave them off the Switch for this long though, considering the starters are some of the most popular mons, and their contemporary Oshawott got its time in the spotlight already. I do have a theory that every starter Pokemon will eventually be made available in Scarlet and Violet though, but I'll talk about that when I get to the Gen 6 section. And that's all the Gen 5 mons not on Switch so far. Spoilers when I go over Gen 6 and 7 in a minute, but 21 is the largest group of missing Pokemon from any generation. However, considering Generation 5 introduced the most Pokemon within a single generation, I don't think it's that surprising that it has the largest missing group. Moving on to Generation 6, which has 66 Pokemon to cover. And we can cut that number almost in half straight away, as 32 of them were in Sword and Shield's base game, leaving us with 34. And between the 9 Gen 6 Pokemon added in the Isle of Armor, and the 6 added in the Crown Tundra, we can take away 14 more, so we're left with an even 20. We can actually completely skip over PLA this time, as the only Gen 6 Pokemon in there were in Sword and Shield already. Moving on to Scarlet and Violet, 10 more as of yet unaccounted for Gen 6 Pokemon were added into that game, including the highly acclaimed Vivillon. Finally, all those Vivillon forms that people have been trading back and forth on home will have a game to go to. Taking away those 10 cuts our total in half, down to 10. And I'm sure the more attentive Gen 6 fans will have seen a very notable absence from the Pokemon listed so far, all of the Gen 6 starters. However, Game Freak obviously took note of this glaring absence, because the Gen 6 starters have already been programmed into Scarlet and Violet. You just can't catch them yet. But once home compatibility is added, you should be able to transfer them in, and I'm sure there'll be events to them too, like there was with the Charizard raid. So even though you can't get them right now, because it's already been confirmed that we'll be able to get them in future, I will tentatively cross them off the list. This would leave Snivy and Tepig the only starter Pokemon not available in any Switch games. But remember earlier when I said I had a theory about all the starters eventually being added to Scarlet and Violet? Well, my theory goes as follows. On top of the Gen 9 starters who are obviously already in the game, Charmander, the X and Y starters, the Swish starters, and the PLA starters have also already been programmed into the game. Due to Charmander being in the game already, I'm assuming they'll eventually add Bulbasaur and Squirtle, like they did with Sword and Shield. The next part is me going out on a limb, but since the PLA starters are just the starter Pokemon from Gens 2, 5 and 7 respectively, I think that means they might add the other starters from those generations as well. And since BDSP was so recent, it would make sense to add the starters from that game as well. To be honest, I'm surprised they aren't in there already. If all that happens, that would literally just leave the Gen 3 starters as the only ones not in the game. And I think that means they would add them in as well, because it would be awkward if they were like the only ones not in there. Obviously, that's all just speculation on my part, and it's also possible they just won't add any more of the starters at all. And Tepig and Snivy will just be left out in the cold to suffer forever. At least Tepig can keep itself warm. Sucks to be Snivy though. Not so smug leaf now, are ya? Anyway, with the Gen 6 starters accounted for, that literally just leaves one single remaining Gen 6 Pokemon, Furfrou. So, like Deerling, Furfrou also has alternate forms. It has several different coats which it can change into by being taken to the groomers. This feature was added to X and Y to reflect how these were the first Pokemon games to have character customization. Now, before researching this video, I had assumed that this grooming gimmick had been abandoned after a single generation, just like Deerling and the season mechanic. But I actually didn't realise that the grooming was in the Gen 7 games, because I just didn't really care enough about Furfrou to check if it was. And if you transfer Furfrou caught in Go to Home, you can even get all its different forms in Home too, so they haven't completely given up on Furfrou's gimmick yet. But I still wouldn't be surprised if the reason Furfrou hasn't appeared in the Switch game yet is because they didn't want to add a dedicated Furfrou groomer. It would be especially awkward to add one in Scarlet and Violet, considering how much they nerfed the character customization in that game. Like, can you imagine if your pet dog looked more stylish than you? This is why I always get uneasy whenever they introduce Pokemon with gimmicky form changes. How much are they going to want to keep bringing back all these form changes? And the methods required to get them in future games? Hopefully my fears will be for nothing and Furfrou will come back in some future DLC. But the more form changing Pokemon they add, the less likely it is that they'll come back. On that somber note, let's move on to Gen 7, which has 61 Pokemon for us to account for. Considering it was the previous generation at the time, quite a few of the Gen 7 ones were in Swish from the get-go, with 34 in the base game, leaving us with 27. And of the 3 generations we've gone through individually, Gen 7 is the first where we can easily account for the starters, as they were programmed in the Sword and Shield from the get-go. So we can take away a further 9 for a remainder of 18. The Isle of Armor DLC added 7 more Gen 7s, which leaves us with a remaining 11 Pokemon. We can skip over the Crown Tundra, as the only Gen 7 ones added there were the Legendaries and Ultra Beasts that we've already gone over. And the only Gen 7 Pokemon in PLA were the Rowlet line, and Alolan Vulpix if that counts. This takes us to Scarlet and Violet, which brought us 7 more Gen 7 Mons, including such fan favourites as this thing, and that thing. This leaves us with only 4 Gen 7s unaccounted for, those being the Pikipek line and Minior. In the previous sections I went on about how certain Pokemon had been neglected for a while, but these guys have only been missing for a single generation, and considering there's only 4 of them, I wouldn't be surprised if they were all added back when/if Scarlet and Violet gets DLC in the future. Taking these 3 groups together, that comes to 26 absent Pokemon, which is 2.6% of the existing 1008 Pokemon. So all in all, a pretty small percentage that don't have any Switch games whatsoever. But we're not done yet, because now that I'm done talking about the regular Pokemon, it's finally time to circle back around to the Mythicals. So I've left off the Mythicals until this point because the requirements for getting them are a little different to regular Pokemon. They're typically only distributed through some special event or require you to jump through some other kind of hoop. Because of this, just owning a game isn't going to cut it if you want the Mythicals available in said game. Instead of going through the Mythicals by generation, I'm going to sort them into groups, with the grouping determined by the best method to obtain each of them. I'll then go through the groups from easiest to obtain to least easiest to obtain, with easiest in quotation marks. Please note that some of these Pokemon have had more than one way to obtain them on Switch, I'm just listing whichever I think is the most currently accessible option. This section will also include spoilers for PLA and Sword and Shield's Crown Tundra DLC. So starting with the groups that's easiest to obtain, the ones you can just straight up catch in a game. Those being Arceus, Manaphy and Phione in Legends Arceus, and Keldeo and Keldeo in the Crown Tundra expansion pass. You have to do lengthy quests before getting them, but at least there are ones you can do in one copy of a game. The next easiest group to obtain are the ones I refer to as the Save Data Squad. These are mythical Pokemon that are obtainable in a game, but require you to have save data from another game in order to get them. To get Mew and Jirachi in BDSP, you need save data from Let's Go and Swish respectively, and to get Shaman and Darkrai in PLA, you need save data from Swish and BDSP respectively. So if you just want these 4 Pokemon, you need to buy 4 separate games that will cost you about $240 altogether. That's great. The next pair is Meltan and Melmetal, who you can transfer from Go into Let's Go. In order to get Melmetal, you do have to grind 400 Meltan candies in order to evolve Meltan, but luckily for me I got Melmetal through an event, so I don't have to do that. On that note, you can transfer some mythical Pokemon you've caught in Go to home, although I am unclear which ones. You aren't allowed to transfer Mew or Serebii, but I'm not sure about the others because those were the only ones listed on Pokemon Go's help page. Yay! Helpful. The next group are the ones you can't get right now, but may have gotten in the past, these being the event onlys. This group includes Victini, Zarude, Zeraora, Celebi, Gengasect, Volcanion, and Marshadow. These have all had special events where you could have received these Pokemon as a gift over the Switch's lifetime. But obviously if you've missed these events, there's not a simple way you can get them for the Switch now. The next group I like to call, well, they're in the game I guess, squad. These are mythicals that have been programmed into a Switch game, but as far as I'm aware, have had no events over the Switch generation for you to obtain them. For Sword and Shield, this includes Diancie and Magearna. Now, for Magearna, you are awarded a special one for completing the Home Pokédex, which I guess counts as a Switch event, but completing the Home Pokédex implies you have a Magearna already. The third member of this group is Deoxys, who is programmed into BDSP, but since there's been no events to get it this generation, the only way to put it in there is by transferring it up from the 3DS. I just find it very funny that they took the time to program all these guys in, but then never had a distribution for anyone to actually get them. And the final group on our list is the I'm not sure about these guys group, which includes Melantolia and Hoopla. They were not programmed into any of the currently home-compatible Switch games, but they have been programmed into Scarlet and Violet, so hopefully that means they'll get an event in future. Although I just went over 3 other mythicals that were in a Switch game and didn't get an event, so I'm not as confident about that. As you may have noticed, I only listed ways you can obtain the mythicals on Switch. Some of these mythicals have had simpler ways you can get them on 3DS, but I only wanted to include methods you could use without having to purchase another system. So we've established that there are still Pokemon not available in the mainline games. But what if we were to broaden our scope and include the spin-off games? Would that finally fill out the dregs of our national decks? Let's find out. I'm not going to go through these in any kind of order, I'm just going to go through them as I think of them. And the first game that comes to mind is New Pokemon Snap. In this game you can see Serperior, Tepig, Ducklet, Swanna, Minior, Pikibek, and Toucannon. With these additions, this leaves off Trumbeak as the only Gen 7 mon not on Switch. Moving on to everyone's favourite addiction-inducing Battle Royale, Pokemon Unite, which brings us 2 more mons we haven't seen on Switch yet, Panpour and Simipour. Weird that it only has one set of the elemental monkeys. Last but not least, Pokken Tournament brought us Snivy as an assist. And I almost missed this, but a few more missing mons have cameos in the backgrounds of the Pokken Tournament stages. These being Furfrou in Old Ferrum Town, Watchog in Ferrum Stadium, and Pignite in Power Training Gym. You know, I had to watch these YouTube videos to find this out, because neither Bulbapedia or Serebii have a list of Pokemon that appear in the backgrounds of Pokemon Tournament stages. God, seriously, step up your game, guys. Also, I know a Pokemon only making a cameo in a side game isn't exactly satisfying if you like the Pokemon and you want to use it in a main game. I just listed the spin-off appearances to be thorough. But that does it for spin-off only mons. There are other spin-off games, but as far as I'm aware, none of them feature any Pokemon I haven't accounted for already. I haven't played all of these games though, so it's possible one of the missing ones did appear in one of these and I just don't know about it. With that, our list of completely absent Pokemon is lowered down to just 13, these being Servine, Emboar, Padorat, Pansage, Simisage, Pansear, Simisear, Blitzel, Zebstrika, Suaddle, Swadloon, Levani, and Trumbeak. So, after going into some unnecessary detail, we have firmly established which Pokemon aren't available on Switch. And by firmly established, I mean it's up to you to decide what counts. Throughout this video it probably sounds like I've been complaining about how long some of these Pokemon have been absent for, which I kind of am. I mean, seriously, what do you guys have against Blitzel? But something I have to acknowledge is how games take time to develop. The most common critique of Scarlet and Violet is how many glaring glitches are present in the game, and how it very clearly needed more development time in order to iron these out. But if these games were given more time, that might lead to longer gaps between main series entries. And if there were longer gaps between entries, that would necessarily mean going even longer gaps of time without seeing certain Pokemon. Think about it. Now if a Pokemon is absent for 2 games, that's only 2 years that they've been absent. But if there were a 5-year gap between entries, then missing out on 2 games would be a 10-year absence. I don't actually think the gaps between entries have to increase that dramatically, but I do think it would be in the series' best interest to give the games enough development time to get the level of quality assurance they deserve. And if a consequence of that is going an even longer gap of time without seeing a specific Pokemon, well, I guess I can deal with that. Anyway, even if all the Pokemon aren't on Switch, at least most of them are in Go! Go doesn't have every Pokemon in it yet, but it does have more Pokemon available than in any mainline game. Pokemon Go Sweep! Woo!